Hello, everyone. I am Rabbi David Ingber, and this is Detours and Destinations from the 92nd Street Y. Conversations with deep thinkers about their journeys, both expected and unexpected, and most importantly, the wisdom gleaned from the twists and turns along the path. Our guest today is writer, journalist, and podcast host Abigail Pogrebin, a former producer for 60 Minutes. She's written extensively for major publications, authored several books, including My Jewish Year and Stars of David. She currently hosts an interview series for JBS, that's the Jewish Broadcasting Service, and the podcast is called In the Spotlight, in which she holds conversations on key issues of the day regarding American Jewry and Israel Jewry, and also, I would add, a fabulous person and a friend of mine. Welcome to Detours and Destinations.
It's great to be with you, and congratulations on this podcast, which is
so
now
much.
Must Listening on my podcast menu.
Thank you so much for that plug. That's great. Yours has also been accompanying me for
Mine
a while.
is scintillating.
Yours is scintillating. Exactly. That was the word I was thinking. Scintillating. It is. I love listening to conversations with people like Rabbi Greenberg and other amazing guests.
It's just fun to be able to ask amazing people, interesting people, anything, even if you disagree with them, which sometimes I do.
Oh, that's true. That's true. So let's start. The name of the podcast, Detours and Destinations, assumes a whole lot, that there are destinations in life and therefore detours. What do you think about that notion? Do you identify with the sense that your life has had a destination, multiple destinations, and then by extension, detours along the way?
It's such a great title, and it is, in a way, the great encapsulation of our lives. And I think, in a way, I feel like all of my life has been detours. I just never really had this grand plan. And I fault myself because I think, maybe I should have. But I'm also grateful that kind of accidents happened as much as they did. Meeting someone here, being mentored by someone there, someone mentioning something, and then you inquire and it becomes an opportunity that is right for you. It's one of the things I have adult kids now that I say is that, trust the accidents. And it's not to try to be cosmic, but it's a sense that not everything is a roadmap you can foresee or plot out. At first I thought I was going to be an actor. I'm sitting here, how many years later, very far from that. But I took it seriously and did a lot of theater growing up. And, then I was in television as a journalist with a lot of stops in the middle, but didn't realize I was ever going to go into print, even though I loved writing. And I was that was my identity as a kid, was, always the sort of creative writing English major type. But it's really because of my children that I got off the road as a TV producer. And then writing became just not my passion, but felt like I was coming home. But podcasting and, being a host and doing public moderating and being a synagogue president, like all of these things I could not have foreseen. And I think if I had had a plan, I might not have almost let myself go down certain detours.
Trusting the accidents, that phrase that you give to your kids, like the way that you held the sense of a destination actually allowed you held it so lightly, or you held it, if you held it at all, that you were able to see each moment as kind of a series of destinations, what we might call detours, if you had a grand plan. So take us back. You mentioned a little bit about, as a young person, you were very involved in theater and were passionate about theater. Tell us a little bit about your family. Come from a very interesting family, a very somewhat well-known family. And what was some of the features of your life growing up and your family and your siblings and some of those details?
Sure. Well, just in an encapsulated form, I grew up on the Upper West Side, which is already, me and every other Jew in New York.
The shtetl.
The shtetl of the Upper West Side. And my mother, I think some people know Letty Cottin-Pogrebin, was a co-founder of Ms. Magazine with Gloria Steinem and four other women in 1972, and she co-created Free to Be You and Me, which was an iconic album and film and book and all of these things, and I grew up around the activism almost like it was in the water. Things at the kitchen table being discussed, things being brought home that were projects, people running through our home, us going into the Ms. offices, us listening to the first songs when Free to Be You and Me was being put together by Marlo Thomas and friends. And my father's a labor lawyer, who interestingly was a labor lawyer on the management side, even though he was as liberal as it gets. He grew up in a little town called Roosevelt, New Jersey, which was actually a WPA project in the Roosevelt era. And my grandmother was one of those early, I don't know, dad has been called a red diaper baby, which, many people of that generation will understand. But basically there was there was a bedrock sense of responsibility, of owing people who were brought up with less, had access to less. But very much my parents were, in a way, going through their own political awakening in real time. I mean, I wouldn't say my mother was born a feminist. Right. She really became one, and my dad as well, sort of together. And it's amazing that their marriage not only survived it, but was exemplified, I think, what an egalitarian marriage is. But I
was at your dad's, the Levaya, the funeral for your father.
You.
And that was a remarkable...
Thank you. Yeah, we lost him about a year ago.
It's remarkable just to hear his life story and how beloved he was.
Yeah. I mean, they just had this sort of joint project of, first of all, their incredible bond and relationship, but also ideas. And so we grew up around their kind of passion for whatever they were doing. And I have to be honest about it, there were people coming through our living room that I didn't realize at the time were as iconic as they were, whether it was Bernard Malamud or, obviously Marlo Thomas, Alan Alda, Max Frankel was the editor of the Times. I mean, I say this not to not name drop, but because you were absorbing things as a kid from all of them. We had this insane Hanukkah party. My mother invited like 70 people and got everybody a present, but you had to perform something. You had to bring like a poem or a lecture or a song. And so, to see Gloria Steinem tap dancing, which a lot of people don't know is her talent, or Max Frankel explaining the Maccabean Revolt, almost like a lecture in college. Like, these were just amazing things.
And they were just in the water.
And they were just in the water. It was just kind of like the fabric. And there was, the usual Jewish pressure to succeed. And that was not lost on any of us. I have a twin sister, Robin. I have a brother, David. And we knew the standards were high, but it wasn't almost articulated. It was just like you got the A-, and it was like, what happened?
Right.
Where's the A?
Right.
Let's figure out how you're going to get that next time.
Right.
It's almost just like this logical thing. Like,
right.
Let's just talk about how that's going to happen.
Right. The flip side of being in a family that's this exceptional, and what's in the water is also, it comes with high expectations.
It does.
And that can be,
Yeah, you either rise to it or
right.
you end up in a lot of therapy.
Right.
I ended up in therapy anyway. But my sister and I, for some reason.
So you mentioned your sister.
She's my identical twin, Robin.
Identical twin sister.
Yeah. And she's a journalist who writes for the Times for 30 years. And my brother's in the culinary world, and he went to the Culinary Institute of America. He was a chef, and then he became a restaurant manager. And
little secret here that we know, I'm going to drop
this.
Oh
my God. And he broke your nose.
Yeah, right. During a period of my life when I was not who I am today, when I was kind of walked away from Judaism for about a decade, I found myself on the Upper West Side playing roller hockey and ice hockey, but roller hockey mostly. And David Pogrebin was a roller hockey guy at that time.
Yeah, he was in the league.
He was in the league, and we played against each other without knowing.
And did he really break your nose?
He really did. He was the guy.
I feel so badly about that.
But it was an accident. I mean,
I know. He's the kindest person.
He's the sweetest. Oh, my goodness. Anyway,
yes, so he's 3 years younger.
3 years younger than you, the two of you.
And Robin and I are identical twins. And we, for some reason, kind of came out of the womb dancing. Like, we literally were performing from day one. And my parents, are wonderful kind of singers. And they appreciate art and going to theater. But they're not, like, performers. And that... Right. I don't know where that came from, but, literally at any dinner party, or even if we weren't asked, I'm sure it was incredibly annoying after a while. It was cute, certainly at the beginning, but we took it really seriously. We were constantly choreographing things, and we would invite people over to act. Like, I thought everybody did that. Like, for what's now known as a play date, we would just say, do you want to come over and act? And that's when we were, 6, 7, 8.
Your natural proclivity is like not a destination, but kind of what is emerging as a passion is that you're naturally doing things. I might throw a ball around, somebody else might play.
We have literally closets full of dress-up clothes, which my mother would get at thrift, things for 25 cents. More clothes to dress up in and jewelry than real clothes. And we knew every lyric of every album of every Broadway show. I mean, literally.
And this, of course, becomes such a deep passion of yours.
Yes, it's an obsession. We want to see everything. I mean, then things were affordable, and we would also see off-Broadway things. And there was something called Equity Library Theater on 103rd Street. I don't know if people even know that, because that building doesn't look like a theater anymore. But my parents had a subscription. We would go there and just wrapped. And we went to Goodspeed Opera House, which is this amazing summer stock in East Haddam, Connecticut, and sit on the steps literally for a week and watch the show over and over again, whatever was playing there. We just, it was bottomless appetite for it. Like, we would see things again and again and again.
And it was the two of you. It was you
yeah,
and
it was
Robin.
really, I mean, we roped my brother in to, like, play the dog if we were
right,
doing
sure.
something, or, the servant.
Sorry, David.
Sorry, David. I mean, he has talent. He's actually a great guitar player, but that came later. But, yeah, it was really Robin and I. And I think we didn't have a sense that we were kind of a show, but because we looked alike and we were very outgoing, a lot of kids are shy, and we just were the antithesis of shy. So we were always auditioning for things, and it sounds more annoying than it was. I just want to say, in my defense,
it sounds great. It sounds
Because
like you
it
had an
just sounds
audience.
like-
You each were like, you had an audience, which speaks to the twinness. And I'm so curious about the twinness because it becomes the topic of a book that you write eventually. But like at this moment, just full disclosure, I'm also a twin. I'm not an identical twin. I have a fraternal twin in Adam. But there was a sense that I always had someone to throw a ball around with, or there was always, the two of us were always doing things together. And so you have, you're acting, you have a built-in.
Yeah. We kind of have a built-in theater company, but we also, I mean, this is one thing I also discovered when I was researching twins. You don't realize how you're skipping steps of kind of social acclimation or awkwardness because you already have your bulwark. You already have your right hand, or, you know, pick your metaphor. And I didn't realize how strengthening that was, how confidence building that was, to just have your ally. So even if someone's mean to you or excluding you, you're like, I'm not excluded, I have my team. And that was definitely, I think, something that is a reason why we had sort of the audacity and maybe the tone deafness to kind of come out swinging the way we did. But yeah, I think we were emboldened because of that, and there was some strength in it, in a way. There was some strength in it.
We'll get back to Robin in particular, or a twinness, but like it led you, actually, you trying out and
being in a Broadway show, which is insane.
It's insane.
But basically, for any Sondheim aficionados, I was in the original cast of his only really major flop, or his most famous flop, I should say, because Sondheim obviously is not only the king of extraordinary musical theater and revolutionary, because people weren't doing things, writing things the way Steve was. So I had this great fortune, very unexpected at 15 years old, to audition for Sondheim's new show, directed by Harold Prince, called Merrily We Roll Along. It was based on a George Kaufman play, and it was going to be choreographed by Ron Field. The book was by George Firth, who wrote Company, and it was just every one of my heroes in musical theater on one show. And, you know, after auditioning for weeks and weeks and thinking there was very little chance that I was actually going to cross that finish line, they finally pulled us all into a room, those of us still standing, and said, you have the part and you're going to be in it. And it was just beyond, dream come true is like one of those cliches that still doesn't capture what that experience was like. Everyone thought this show was going to be the next Company, the next Little Night Music, and crashed and burned after 16 performances. Like, we really ran for such a short time, but we rehearsed for a year. We were in previews for 3 months. So it was a long story, and we were all kids. So there was something really, there was a lot of pathos in our failure because everyone was rooting for us and feeling like this was going to be kind of this young cast. You know, the conceit of the show is that it goes backwards chronologically. And so we were basically like teenagers and young 20s playing people in their 50s and then going back in time to when we were not jaded, because when we had stars in our eyes and we were not disillusioned. And
do you remember? And can you sing a little thing?
no, I can't. You can't sing anymore because
anymore?
And the reason why I can't sing anymore is Merrily, because there was this unbelievable reunion. I think it was 2002, and I didn't think it was going to be so serious. Like, I didn't realize we were going to be rehearsing for a week, and Steve Sondheim was going to be there, and we were going to have Susan Stroman was our director, and I blew my vocal cords out just trying to keep up because I really wasn't a singer anymore. I was a journalist by then, so I really can't sing. But
Okay.
I will say, you know, if I got drunk right now, I would. But I just do
We might have
to
some liquor.
we have to add that to this podcast.
Yes,
you know,
so
some kind of bar.
That's a detour.
That's a
different kind.
detour.
We'll call that's the name of the brand, a detour.
But I will say for anyone listening that they know that Merrily finally had its day, which is very recent in the success that it had on Broadway with Daniel Radcliffe and Jonathan Groff, and it won the Tony, and so we were vindicated. The score was incredible, and the script is problematic, and it was definitely was a shaping experience to see your heroes stumble, struggle, and ultimately not figure it out. And I think that talk about detours and destinations, when I got into that show, I had no hubris about thinking that I was going to be a star, but I did think, okay, it's been confirmed that maybe I could do this, and I have enough talent to sort of be in this pool. And then when you just watch people who you think never fail actually really stumble so visibly, you realize nothing is assured. And there is no actual kind of safe blueprint that you can count on. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't try things, but it definitely not just humbles you, it rattles you. And it definitely had that effect for
And
me.
it rattled you.
Yeah. I think I was like, I'm not sure I want to be in a business where you can be at the zenith and literally plunge off a cliff the next day.
Wow.
Yeah.
The sense, though, that you said that it was a detour, or it was like the epitome of a detour, and that you learned from it, what you took from it, was that you didn't want to be in an industry, or you wouldn't want to be in a position where you could be at the zenith of the industry and then still go off the cliff. And it just reminded me of this rabbinic dictum. It appears in the Talmud, where the Talmud says, "Ein adam omed al divrei Torah." A person can't stand on Torah. Omed is like a understanding or standing. Ela im kein nichshal bahen tchila, unless you've failed in Torah first. Like there's something about failing in Torah that allows you to then eventually stand on Torah. But you were crestfallen. It was very disillusioning. And so did you say, okay, I'm pivoting here, or you started?
Well, I stuck with it, but I think something got filed away.
Yeah.
And I also am not necessarily proud of my lack of courage. Like it showed basically that you have to have a kind of resilience for this particular industry that maybe I lacked for all of my type A-ness, which is that I want to be able to build on something and not keep starting from scratch. I wanted that if you do A and you do B, then you get to C and you get to stay there. It's not that you go back to like A minus or A, minus zero, whatever, again,
Right.
the symbolism. And that's, I think, was the awakening. It almost doesn't matter, first of all, whether you're talented or whether you've reached a mark. You might have to go back to the start. And that's not necessarily inaccurate for any industry, but particularly for this one, there was going to be a lack of control that I confronted, which is you were going to be at the mercy of people choosing you and also of those people succeeding in their artistic field. So I wasn't going to be the creator. I was going to be the one raising my hand and saying, please take me. And then I hope you do what you need to do so that I can stay in this.
A lot of dependency on other people.
Yeah, a lot of
right?
dependency.
A lot of dependency on people. But
And as
you
you can
mentioned
see-
control. I know. You used the
I'm
word.
not so good at that.
Well, we don't know. I mean, but those who know you.
No, but wanting agency, wanting a
Agency,
sense
yeah.
of like, if you work really hard,
Right.
you're not assured of something, but you have some hands on the controls. And I realized that it wasn't going to be none, but it was going to be pretty minimal.
And so where did that take you? So you go to college.
So then I go to college, and I was lucky enough to go to Yale. I did a lot of theater there with just some amazing people
theater,
and friends, and I worked
Jodie
with
Foster.
Tina Landau, I mentioned,
Yeah.
who actually was very good friends with Jodie Foster. I didn't know Jodie, but Tina directed me in things. She now has Redwood on Broadway, and Floyd Collins. I mean, she's amazing. And Ira Sachs directed me, and he's a filmmaker. They were just wonderful, wonderful friends I had there and worked with. And that was all great, but I was really focused on writing. And journalism became kind of, I just had so much curiosity about things, and it was a way to combine the writing and the asking. And so that was really what I started to do in summers.
What'd you do with your theater? You put it on the side.
First of all, I kept seeing theater, and I was in shows until my senior year in college. I never stopped that, but I was definitely a multitasker and was kind of pivoting a bit, I think.
And how early, I mean, you're the daughter, you and Robin together became journalists, but both of you are the daughters of someone who's a known writer,
Yes,
starts the
Mom's
magazine.
written 12 books.
12 books.
I know.
So from a young age, did you know that you were...
Writing was just very much in the DNA, and it was something that, my mom was a merciless editor, which I think I learned from. She was never writing for us, but she was absolutely saying where something wasn't hanging together or tracking, or whether there were too many words or too many cliches. I mean, that becomes like a muscle, like you're working out, like exercise. So both Robin and I just grew up in that, again, the crucible of working and reworking. I was always writing short stories. I was like keeping diaries very religiously. I have like too many volumes to count. I think I started ripping out some pages of it with embarrassment when I got to be an adult. But I kept journals, for a long time. And Robin left theater sooner. So she was doing journalism sooner than I was. And at Yale, she was on the Yale Daily and things. I think I was watching her pivot. And then I worked for Fred Friendly. Some people don't remember him. He used to produce Edward R. Murrow, CBS. And actually, it's funny, just to come back to Broadway, George Clooney is playing Edward R. Murrow now on Broadway and See It Now. But his producer was Fred Friendly, and that was my first real boss in journalism. He had this incredible series on PBS, and I asked if he might need an intern. And that's where I started working in my summers of college, and it just changed everything.
So that becomes
that becomes my journalism.
Your destination.
Start.
You're
That's
there.
my new destination.
And within that newly found destination, did you begin to set up destinations? Like your ambition,
I'm definitely
ambitious.
like learning as I go,
Mm-hmm.
and then I move out to San Francisco for personal reasons and work for McNeil Lehrer. Some of you may remember
Sure.
there was a reporter out there, and then I want to come home, and I'm working for Charlie Rose, who was starting his show then. I became one of his first producers, and then I worked for Bill Moyers at PBS. Again, it's just an extraordinary documentary maker, and then I worked for 60 Minutes, so I'm in that incredible world of television journalism. I'm learning as I go.
Storytelling.
And storytelling is the key, David.
Yeah.
Like, that's where, in a way, the theater married the journalism. And it's different because you better be telling the truth and not
Right.
inventing things. But in terms of learning...
Unless you're living now.
Unless now.
Right.
Now you can make everything
Too bad
up.
you could
Yeah,
make
all
everything
those
up.
rules I learned are out the window. It's like I wasted a lot of time on journalistic ethics. My God, the discipline of that growing up is out the window. It's so sad. But the storytelling is key. What you're saying is like when you do a ton of reporting, it's so much amassing. You're interviewing constantly. You're absorbing as much as you can of a story, and then you're basically slicing and shaving and figuring out what's the through line here, what's the thread, and what is the arc, and what's the drama that is not invented but is going to make people stay with it and understand it and learn from it. So whether I was at 60 Minutes doing that, where you would tape and record and have 12 minutes at the end of the day, and you'd work on a story for like 2 to 3 months, and it comes down to 12 minutes on the air. And by the way, you don't have fact checkers, so you better be right, because 20 million people are relying on that. And then when I switched to print, it was even more so, or on the page, it has to be something that pulls you and grabs you and instructs you. And so I loved that discipline, even as I would tear my hair out.
Both of your passions are disciplines, and you've had great mentors, and just the list of those mentors was incredible.
Incredible.
And at that time, you're trading notes with your mom, trading notes with your sister. I mean,
we're always talking about what we're doing, but at that point, we were doing pretty different things. My mom really is an advocate, and I will say, talk about bravery. She is just no holds barred in saying what she thinks and writing what she thinks. And we don't always see eye to eye, which is healthy. But what I have never stopped admiring is her fearlessness. I think when you, again, were a pioneer, as she was, as Gloria was, and you were pushing against so much that was suffocating and stultifying and saying you can't be this, you can't do this, which is what women really faced in those times, you really don't give a lot of a, bleep, about whether somebody either likes you or is going to cancel you, although they didn't use that term in those days. You say what you think and you fight for what you believe. I grew up in a much more, I think, like wanting to preserve the long game. And so she would sometimes say, you're not demanding enough, you're not advocating for yourself enough, and why don't you sign this petition? Or, I wanted to be more of that storyteller that wasn't necessarily putting my thumb on the scale for what I think. I think sometimes people understand in my journalism where I fall, but I also want them to believe and really believe the truth of the fact that I can sit with anybody and really be curious and really want to understand their perspective and their story. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to end up being convinced by them. But I kind of want the authenticity of curiosity to be believed, to be trusted.
What do you chalk that up to? I mean, when you think back on it, and even telling the story now, kind of in a meta way, telling the story of your own story with your mom, do you say that you are the beneficiary because you framed it almost as a generational piece? Is it that plus more of your kind of innate, like do you see yourself innately predisposed in that way, that you're more, like theater itself means that you inhabit a character, the ability to inhabit multiple characters, right? And that capacity to kind of put yourself, the self, whatever it is, on the side and say, oh, I'm going to be this character, seems to be something that you were preternaturally, from a very early age, curious about. And is that something that you maybe don't share with your mom, or is it like...
That's interesting. I mean, I feel like the journalist hat, which is where I've landed and been now for 25 years, allows me to kind of move into rooms and conversations without necessarily saying what I think, but being able to ask anything I'm curious, I want to know. And that's, to me, such a privileged position. What I absorbed from my mom is the rigor of, you better have done your research, you better have done your homework. You don't just come out lazily. There was so much of a sense of being prepared from her. But she is much more revealing that Letty Pogrebin is who you're getting.
Right.
And I don't necessarily know that people are exactly knowing what I'm feeling or saying. Maybe I'm deluding myself. And you, David Ingber, would say, as one of my rabbis, I know exactly what you think.
Yeah, I know.
You are hiding nothing. But it does, I do feel like, and I think hopefully my track record proves it, and particularly, and I'm sure we'll get to it, in this incredibly polarized time, and particularly since October 7th, where every time I'm interviewing someone, I almost feel like I'm being political just because I've invited them on my podcast or on my television show. It's like, there are some people who say, like, why are you even listening to that person?
Right.
And I think that's where we've gotten to a point where we're policing each other, and we're even policing the questions we ask. And I bemoan it, because I think so much is lost in those kinds of judgments or prejudgments. Right. But I would say before we got to the height of polarization and division, I just feel like it's where I'm more comfortable as the questioner.
Right. What's interesting, though, just as your career in journalism moves along, you eventually, you've written a number of books. And one of the books that's one of the most fascinating reads, and especially for a twin like me, albeit not an identical twin, is the book that you write about one and the same. My life is an identical twin, and what I've learned about everyone's struggle to be singular. That's a very much your own point of view and your own internal experience.
That's true.
And
you're absolutely right.
And so, what led you to want to write that book? And
it's
at what point in your life?
It's so interesting that, like, my journalism so much ended up in the Jewish world, because that's where, like, my deepest curiosity kind of was ignited. I just really was led by what interested me, and I kept being most interested.
So tell us about that a little bit. Let's detour into your
Okay,
Jewish.
I will say it, but just before we leave the twins book, that was in a way a detour from the Jewish inquiry. And it was part of it was because I felt like I had never plumbed this identity ride that was so fundamental to who I am, which is that I grew up with a double, essentially. Like, at every turn, we were mixed up, and at every turn, people were asking us questions and assuming things and lumping us together in ways that were both annoying and wonderful. And Rob and I are so close, but the separation issues got complicated when we were older, and I felt like we can't be the only ones, this roller coaster. And particularly that sense of, I think for everyone, we confront at what point, how am I set apart? It doesn't mean like, how am I famous or wonderful? It's more like, how am I individual? Mm. How am I separate from others? Yeah. And what is the mark I'm leaving? It may not be like I am, creating some great contribution. Hopefully we don't have the hubris of that. But I think particularly in Jewish teaching, there is a sense that we've all been put here for a reason, and that there's something being asked of us. And it's sometimes hard as an identical twin when you're conflated, and when you are literally, people don't absorb that we are DNA replicas of each other. That's crazy.
It is crazy.
And so what does that mean? How do you differentiate? Like, of course, there's all these ways, but I wanted to take on journalistically that issue, to talk to scientists, talk to psychologists, talk to geneticists, to sort of ask every possible expert. But I also talked to adult twins, which really had not happened before, of saying, how did this work out for you? People are so focused on, like, should I separate my kids in high school or college? Should they sleep in separate rooms? Should I dress them differently? They're so obsessed with sort of the practical. Obsessed sounds derogatory. That's where most parents go. I wanted to say, do you want to hear some of the veterans and how this worked out? Because there's some things that might actually change the way you're raising them now in terms of the complexities of identity and individuation.
So I want to hear some of those and share those with the listeners. But parenthetically, just before we get there, just look, my own experience, like that, I'm not an identical twin, so I don't have the DNA, that replication. But if you can find a way to differentiate, even when someone has the same face as you, right? When you look in the mirror, you might as well be looking in the mirror or be looking at your sister. And that sense of being inside or outside of your own self, or like the complexity of that question, if you can figure out how to do that even as an identical twin, then all the more so if you don't share the same DNA and you're just, your average separation issues, right? Like just my own face, my own body, my own space, my own particular stamp, my own fingerprint, my own soul print, whatever you want to call it. So it's really a great service if you can figure out that riddle.
Really great
and it's
point.
Also a question, in just biblically, I know that we're talking Jewishly in a second, but from a Jewish perspective, the biblical stories and chosenness and uniqueness and gifted and all of that is kind of interwoven into the myths of the book of Genesis. And of course, Jacob and Esau are like, they're not identical twins, right? But if you have the problem of chosenness is going to be at peak level, where one isn't really older than the other one, right? So you said if you could help give some advice to some of your average, like people who are obsessed about individuation, what did you discover?
I just think it's so fundamental, and parents don't realize this just generally, of individual time with your kid. There's so much of a sense often of the tumult of parenting early and doing things and moving as a family and moving the kids together. And particularly when they're twins, like the twins don't want to be apart. So you're actually pushing against something that feels counterintuitive. Well, they want to be together. They don't want to do things separately. And that's the one mistake I think my parents made that was kind of on the more macro level that they would admit, and sadly Dad's gone, but they acknowledged, is that we really never did anything separately with them. And
did they call you the twins?
Yeah, I mean, they didn't call us the twins. They dressed us in red and blue so that other people wouldn't mix us up, which was some recognition
of individuation,
of trying to at least help with that. But you can't escape the sort of like cuteness, compactness, quaintness of this twosome that sort of like you also begin to play on it. Like we're a little bit of there's a certain magic in it. And then the fact that we did look so alike. Some identical twins don't look as much alike as Robin and I did. I mean, there's some pictures, plenty of pictures I can't be sure of myself. And that's just sort of a strange.
That's very odd.
You know, my son last week on the street, it was the first time that he called me Robin from a block, half a block away. And I was like, he came over and he admitted, he was like, oh my God, I just called you my aunt.
Oh, no.
And I was like, are you kidding me? Like now I really need...
Well, since you said that, I'll admit that once in the parking garage, we share a parking garage with Robin.
Oh, you and Robin.
Yeah,
okay, but it's different. You're not my son.
That's true. That's true. But I should be
You're excused.
Well, if he did it, then I feel much better. But so the need to individuate even when the kids want to be together, and
and I think also a recognition,
special time with each other and having separate time and treating them.
And also asking more questions about sort of how the sort of self stuff is going without being overly mushy about it, of kind of checking in. I think one of the things that, and Robin articulates this in the book, One and the Same, which is still available on Amazon, but she was very honest about the fact that her individuation came much later. Like she wasn't sort of feeling like she needed it. And when I interviewed all these experts, they said this can happen at 12 and it can happen at 60, where suddenly you're just like, I need some distance. And it can be rending. Painful, and it was for us because Robin, it happened to her in her 30s. I'm like, why are you separating now? Like, why do you need distance from me now? It was really, I mean, I can sort of joke about it now, but it felt so rejecting at the time. And then there's some twins who never separate, and that was strange to interview. And also, I mean, again, it sounds judgmental, but I kind of felt like saying to them, you need a little breath from each other, a little space from each other. Anyway, so all those issues.
And
I just mentioned the Bible, though, just to interrupt you as a rabbi, because you mentioned Jacob and Esau.
If you're going Bible, I'm happy. Just go Bible.
But what I was going to say is, that moment where Jacob thinks that Esau is going to come and attack him, and instead there's essentially a kiss, right? There's some, whatever that cantillation mark.
No special, like, diacritical marks that are over the word.
I knew you'd have the word for it.
That he kisses him.
Like there's dots or something.
The dots, yeah.
So it's like it might be a kiss, right? Or it might be. And I just thought that's what's true to me. Like, it doesn't ring true to me, not that I can judge the Bible, but it doesn't make sense to me that there would be a wound that would not heal. That doesn't ring true for me in my relationship. And even in any twin relationship that I interviewed, like there has to be kind of a coming back together. It's almost like it's counter-genetic almost to stay apart. It doesn't mean that there weren't rifts. I interviewed some twins who didn't speak to each other. And jealousy, but I always feel like that's very oversimplified.
Was there any gender difference? Like, were identical girls
You mean in my research?
Yeah.
Well, certainly fraternal twins generally don't have the same identity issues exactly, but there could sometimes be just as much of the competition issues.
But gender stuff, like, were identical girls have...
I find that the identical twins I interviewed pretty much had the same intimacy level of intensity. Like, it really is just a whole other kind of, like, species of intimacy. It's very hard for people to fathom. My husband,
I was about to ask about...
Well, he has twin sisters.
Oh, he does?
And they're identical. And thank God.
So he's the David...
He's the David.
He's the
just
David
like my
of
David.
your younger brother David to his
it's
sisters.
Exactly mirrored, 3 years apart. And thank God for it. I'm not kidding, because he really understood the kind of, like, why I sort of prioritize that relationship sometimes above any other. It's just kind of instinctual, impulsive, and logical in ways that it might not be to anyone else.
And logical and inevitable. Like that was what you couldn't imagine. The irreconcilability of the biblical characters is the same way that ultimately, no matter what detours you go on, ultimately your destination is to come back together in some way.
You kind of have to be. You're not settled.
You're not settled.
You're not settled with division and separateness. Not if it's at the core. Not if it's like cellular.
Yeah, I've been looking at that also with my own brother for years. It's different, obviously. We're fraternal, but we went through periods where we were closer and then separate. And there's a longing. It doesn't matter if we don't speak for a long time. There's something in the laugh. There's something so early that is almost, it's somatic. It's like in the body.
That's the perfect way of putting it.
We giggle in a way that's just different.
Different.
It's just very different. So you were saying about
the Jews. So we should get back to
the
Jews.
Because I want to know, like you were as a journalist thinking and very comfortable. By the way, maybe it's a twin thing too. By the way, I'm sure you've thought this through. That the twinning allows you always to be kind of on the inside and also on the outside. Don't talk about your experience. I always used to feel very comfortable, like my brother, and he would do the same,
So
kind of
true.
putting us in the center.
Yeah.
But you end up writing this very intimate and yet journalistic work about your experience, maybe the most intimate experience of your life. But you said you got there through Judaism. So Judaism and you're growing up?
The first book I wrote was on Stars of David, where I interviewed famous Jews, everyone from Ruth Bader Ginsburg to Steven Spielberg, about Jewish identity. And I think it really was my kind of very backdoor, kind of stealth, unself-aware path to figuring out my own kind of Jewish reckoning. I was raised by a mother who grew up as a very conservadox Jew in Jamaica, Queens, and my mother was really raised as the son that her father didn't have. And she's written about this in her book Deborah Gold and Me, but she had this kind of really this break when she wasn't allowed to say Kaddish at Shiva, and they went and basically got a 10th man, a stranger, because she was female. And that was just so rending for her that despite her education, really, she was really steeped in it and understood and knew and was well-versed in a way that was very rare for the 1950s for a woman. She turned her back on it for a while, and we fell through the cracks of that. So we had a home-based Judaism, definitely Shabbat. We just went to services on the high holidays. We had 2 Seders plus the feminist Seder when that was created in the 70s. So it's not that we didn't have Judaism, but I missed the scaffolding that you were raised with. I didn't have the Hebrew. I was not bat mitzvahed. I wasn't well versed when we went into synagogue. I felt like a fish out of water. I had the familiarity of just the service we knew, but I didn't belong to synagogue, and I didn't have a community like that. And it was really only when I did that first book and then I had my first child that I said, I need to know what this means and what this is about. I know that's happened to so many people. It's almost like a platitude to say, you have a kid and you have to suddenly ask yourself, what am I passing on and what is this language? And so I started to study Torah, and it really was one of those eureka experiences where I just loved it. I wanted more of it. I started auditing classes at JTS, and I had a Genesis class with Bert Visotsky in my home. He's amazing, a JTS Midrash expert, and it was amazing. For 6 years we studied Genesis, and then switched to the Hadar guys. Shai Held and Ellie Counfer taught us Exodus.
Hadar Institute here in New York.
Yes.
Yeah, amazing.
And obviously met people like you along the way, and I just began to, my journalism turned to the Judaism, and I was getting transformed, I think, in my own kind of Jewish prioritization, like caring more, wanting more. But I also had sort of the ruse of the journalist being able to ask any questions. So when I wrote my book about the holidays, which was basically saying, I don't like that I don't understand why there are 15,000 holidays just between, August and September. So I wrote my Jewish year, and you were one of the incredibly generous teachers through that book. And it first started as a series for the Forward, where in real time I was writing about it. So I would prepare for it, research it, pick where I was going to go to observe it, and then write about it afterwards, after the Chag was over and writing was permitted, and I could assemble all my notes. And all of that was just, first of all, keeping up was, I don't know how you all do it every time. 6 fasts is not something I'm eager to repeat. But just in terms of absorbing why, I think you called it the spiritual technology. And that was just that is stuck in my mind, as so many of your teachings have, of why does it matter? Why does Shmini Atzeret actually resonate now? And because I think that our tradition stands up to kicking the tires on it and not just saying, well, it's Shmini Atzeret's here, so you've got to go do these 5 things. Or Shavuot is here, so you have to stay up all night. It's being able to ask, like, how does this speak to this moment? And discovering that it constantly answers it is just incredible to me. I'm still dazzled by it.
When you did the Stars of David and you were speaking to people about their Jewish identity, I'm sure there was something revelatory about how people frame their Jewish identity. But my own curiosity, was there something lacking too when you spoke to them, and a sense of like, oh, here I am, you're incredibly inquisitive, curious person, intellectually, rigorous and able.
Anal.
Yeah. No, not exactly. It wasn't the next word that I had coming, but it was like, did you find like, oh, do they even know how much depth is there? Or am I, like, there's so much there, and I better find out.
Yeah.
Did your investigative journalist
It's
kind
such
of like.
a great question, because not only was I surprised by how much they had stopped, like they were raised with it. They had begun this journey, and then they kind of left it. They sort of, sometimes it was like, I'm going to just shelve this thing here. But often it was just kind of by attrition. They just let it float away. And as a journalist, I had to note it, but I also wanted to investigate it. Like, why is this something you could just leave behind? And what you realize is, first of all, and I wrote that book and came out in 2005, this was a generation where assimilation was the goal, right? Like, that was the holy grail, which is maybe mixed metaphor, was to more Americanize yourself, to sort of differentiate yourself. It wasn't about celebrating difference, and it wasn't about your Jewish last name or your nose that might be telling in some way, like in Dustin Hoffman's case. It was all about, I need to be able to play any role. I need to be able to show up in this meeting and not be narrowed in any way. So there was a kind of, I don't want to say like denuding of themselves, but they weren't kind of doubling down on their...
Hollywood.
Yeah.
Right.
It was Hollywood,
Kirk
or
Douglas,
it was journalism, or it was, name your industry.
Right.
But there were very few people who had really stuck with or even amplified their kind of really specificity of their let alone their observance. I could count on one hand how many out of like 62 were, I would say, observant Jews. That's a lot of, I don't want to say loss, because it's
very telling.
Yeah, it's very telling. And when I was on book tour, I remember there were some Orthodox communities that would invite me and then say, how can you call this book Stars of David? They're not stars of us. They've disappointed us. It was really interesting that some were really deflated by it. I mean, they wanted to hear like every single thing about whether it was Larry King or, who's the swimmer? I'm forgetting now. Oh my gosh, who won the
my God, Spitz.
Spitz. Yeah, they wanted to hear all the backstory of sitting with them and interviewing them, but then they sometimes were kind of scolding them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
it's kind of the push-pull of wanting notoriety and wanting to be like Jews who have made it or Jews who are seen. Like, I know growing up as an Orthodox kid, if you had a Jewish kid who played basketball, they would call them like the next Jordan or whatever it would be, And it didn't matter like what their level of observance was, but if they wore a yarmulke, if they were covering their head, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
So there's something that we recognize is potentially compromise that you have to make in order to make it or to be visible.
Yeah, and I think that changed.
Yeah, it's changed
dramatically, and then now obviously post-October 7th, it's changed again, I think, in different ways. But at that time, it really wasn't so much the celebration of one's.
And so you get very Jewishly involved, and so involved that you do something that almost everyone would tell you never to do, as you become the president of a huge New York City institution, Central Synagogue.
Yeah. And for those who don't know, it's in Midtown, and it's a Reform synagogue. And I have to say, with all due respect, but just in numbers, is probably the largest in the country. And that's not due to anything. I say that without taking any credit for it. But walking into the presidency where you have this kind of Fabergé egg that you don't want to drop was definitely daunting. Not to mention, there's a lot of, machers there who want to disappoint.
Some big shots that you don't want to disappoint.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's New York.
And they all have your email.
So out of the pan into the fire, you're involved, and true to form, you immerse yourself completely in this. You're now taking classes, interviewing, writing books about Jewish holidays, president of maybe the largest synagogue in the country, and you are parlaying also your love for journalism and for investigative journalism and interviewing. I mean, when I met you, you were interviewing everybody. Like, everybody would want to be interviewed by Abigail Pogrebin
Thank
because
you.
as you said already, you did your homework. You
Thank
came in
you.
prepared,
Thank you.
and you were going to ask incredible questions. Like,
Thank you.
was that another destination that
Yeah,
kind
I mean,
of
I
emerges
think that
from?
just was like all through my journalism. It was that sense of wanting someone to be comfortable enough to be truthful and to get to that place, like in any conversation with a friend where it's not just the platitudes. Like even for Stars of David, if I sat down with a Kenneth Cole, the designer, or a Stephen Breyer, Supreme Court Justice, it's like I don't want to just hear about your Seder for an hour. The Seder matters, but I want to get to that place where you had to make a difficult decision that connected to Judaism, where you were thinking about your children, or Stephen Breyer's daughter is a priest, is a pastor. I mean, that's just really interesting, and I want to understand that. Kenneth Cole was married to Maria Cuomo, who was raised in a very strong Catholic family, and what was that decision about raising your kids? And it's not to be prurient, it's to sort of get to the heart of things, because one thing you know with any Jew of any stripe is that you've had to reckon with this at some point. You had to kind of take this off the shelf and talk about it even with yourself. And
Did you ever interview your mom and ask her about that moment where she decided to?
I've interviewed my mom, but never for a book. But it's really interesting because, especially having lost my dad, I sort of feel like I need to kind of put on tape, like asking my mom any possible question. Because my mom's written so much about her own trajectory, I sort of feel like it's there. But yeah.
Might be different if you ask if
if
you're asking her.
It would be different. It would be different. I think also, and Central Synagogue, I don't want to gloss over it, because even though I sort of say like, oh, I survived the presidency because we all are a fraternity or a sorority, but pick your metaphor, it was one of the most meaningful things I've ever done in my life.
Yeah,
and
why?
I think part of it was not just working with this incredible leadership of the clergy that are there, led by Angela Bookdahl, the senior rabbi, but all the others who are extraordinary, but watching up close, seeing up close the daily pastoral needs and clefts. I mean, these moments where a rabbi, a cantor, an executive director, a security guard could make all the difference. Like seeing that on a daily basis changed my Judaism. There's so many kind of big conferences and articles and conversations, but the minutia of the day-to-day of seeing Angela Bookdahl cross-legged on the floor with 3-year-olds playing the guitar, that you realize, like, this is what it's about.
Right.
There's no getting too big for those moments that are what makes a Jew or loses a Jew.
So, I mean, a question I want to come to in the spotlight, because that's what you've been working on now, and you've been talking to so many different people, and it's like a big deal, these conversations that span, the full texture of Jewish life.
Thank you. And it's on every
Israel,
podcast platform that you can find it,
exactly.
in addition to this one.
But I want to just pick up on that last piece and then pivot into in the spotlight, because you said that's what it's all about. And so I guess a lot of people leave being the president of a synagogue more depressed about Jewish life than they were when they took it, or more, I guess, chastened by their idyllic, But did you walk away, and where are you now with the sense of optimism about North American Jewish life? And of course, in the post-October 7th world also, there's kind of what's going to be with the next generation. And
right. It's
I think
upheaval
we were white-knuckling as we walked, even before we were like, oh, the Pew studies and young people. And what's your sense? Did you walk out of that saying, okay, there's hope and we just have to do these things?
So much hope. I mean, obviously, let's posit that October 7th is not just devastating, but I still don't sleep at night because of it. And I don't say that for anyone to feel sorry for me. I'm saying I can't get over it. And I feel like it's been an inflection point for me in just assumptions and orientation that was a whole other podcast to discuss. But what has given me a sense of not just hope, but kind of strength is the surge. And I think it's undeniable. And, we didn't talk about my most recent book, which is a co-authorship with Rabbi Dov Linzer, who's an Orthodox rabbi.
I studied with Dov at Chovevei Torah.
Right?
Yeah.
And he's the president of Chovevei Torah as we discussed this. And we've traveled the country this year and seeing all of these communities where person after to a person or community to a community, you just see people are showing up in numbers they never did before, getting, adult bar bat mitzvah deciding to convert, deciding to learn, starting, groups, small groups of study. Like those blossoms, those shoots were everywhere. Whether we were in Utah, where I thought 5 Jews were going to show up and there was a full room of 100, or whether we were in Boca. And again, to be that pair of, because we're such different Jews, Dov and I, like, again, we could not be more different. Is that
yet another example of what you had said earlier about, almost an hour ago, I guess, about your dedication, the discipline of listening and being able to be with someone who you might have a completely different. Mom wasn't upset that you were with an Orthodox rabbi.
No, I think she wasn't. I think her only concern, and it was also my rabbi Angela Puchtal's concern, is that I would sort of make myself so small, because there's just no comparison about mastery here.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, he's memorized these documents and he's studied them and taught them for 30 years, and
but he's a feminist also, so that's kind of amazing.
And he was extraordinary in his generosity and his invitation, not just to talk about these texts, but to constantly push me and say, Abby, you're asking too many questions, and it's my turn to ask you, and this has to stay a conversation. And we did that as a podcast, which is now this book called It Takes Two to Torah. But I will just say, all of it's of a piece for me, which is that when I see the robustness of connection, and it's showing up, whether someone's buying a Mogen David or putting up a mezuzah or going the full, Megillah, I would say, and becoming a Jew when they weren't one. And I'm not saying one is better than the other. It's just seeing how many people were reckoning with this thing they'd taken for granted or never investigated before. And that has to give me hope, because I think there was a lot of laziness about just what it meant to be a Jew before. I really do. And I saw it, in my journalism, and I saw it in my kind of Jewish travels of just like, I do what I do and it's fine. It's enough.
And in the course of the last year and a half, or almost 2 years, you've seen that also with those that you've been interviewing in the spotlight.
100%. I mean,
that there's a sense of an awakening, a sense of something that had been dormant, or something that had been taken for granted, or something that wasn't clearly visible, or something that wasn't really worth fighting for. It's kind of there. All of that has kind of been re-energized. It's kind of reawakened.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And obviously Israel's a piece of it, and having to figure out not just one's relationship to Israel, but do I understand Israel? Have I ever really investigated the history? Did I just take what my parents said, or what I learned in dribs and drabs from relatives or articles, or am I going to actually take this on? Because it is complicated and it is deep and long, and I feel like there's been laziness just about even understanding what we've inherited in that way. I think we have to be honest about it. It's a more tribal moment for the communities I'm visiting, and I think reckoning with that. Like, what does it mean to feel like that line from the Haggadah, "In every generation our enemy rises up," is suddenly more true than I thought it was before, and where does that leave me as a Jew who was also raised to say, welcome the stranger, love the stranger, don't oppress the stranger because we were the stranger.
I just want to stop there for a second. I know that we're we're almost coming at time here, but just to explain what you said, that because it resonates so deeply with me, and I think it might resonate with many who are listening, that there is in the Haggadah, which is of course the retelling of the Passover story that we use at the celebratory meal called the Seder. There's a section that says, in every generation they gather up, or they rise up to kill us.
And God saves us.
And God saves us. So there is that moment of deep suspicion, or the inevitability of anti-Semitism, the inevitability that we're never going to be clear, and that runs counter to mine and your kind of assumption of liberal progress. Like, we want to live in a world where, of course, we can end anti-Semitism, of course we can end misogyny, and we can end homophobia and all of the other kinds of hatred.
And also, of course, we're supposed to be worrying and caring about this person who is struggling over here, who is not like us, and who is not necessarily in my either proverbial or literal religious family. And suddenly, I feel like even I was pushed to say, you know what, Abby, you're a little naive there, because look at this.
Wow.
And
that's a detour.
It's a detour.
All of us have had that
and
since October 7th.
It's one that I still feel like, talk about needing all of you, who are my rabbis, to sort of help me talk that through in a way that is not going to get me canceled just for exploring it. Because I just feel like we're in that time where even having that conversation is radioactive. Radioactive
Conversations. That's a title.
Another podcast.
That's another podcast.
Which neither you or I want to host.
So I agree with you. I mean, which brings us, of course, to the present moment and what many of us are experiencing as disorienting, just at least very confusing. As a journalist, I mean, just to pick one thing, just seeing what's happening in the world of journalism, there are people who have left legacy institutions because of their bias and their inability to kind of hold multiple perspectives. What's giving you at this moment? Like, you have so much that you've seen. Is this a moment for us to be expressing our opinion the way that your mom would want us to do, and each one should stand up and protest? Is it a moment to like try to understand the other? Like, how are you navigating, and what's giving you a sense of hope? You know?
I mean, I feel like it is much more a listening than a shouting moment. And I think part of it is just what we've lived through in terms of these last two elections, in terms of the polarization, in terms of the ugliness, and in terms of the fact that the playbook has kind of failed on all sides. I won't say both sides, all sides. And I'm not just saying all sides to be diplomatic. I feel like there's just been too much of them and us, whether it's politically, whether it's Jewishly, and it hasn't served us and actually hasn't gotten us to a constructive place. So I want the playbook to either be revisited, maybe be reimagined, and kind of do some harder work on what we've learned, and not just kind of stomping our feet and saying, well, we've got to go back at it, you know? And I say that without exactly saying where I fall, although some people can assume where I fall. I just see that outrage is cheap and it's not necessarily effective. And I'm not saying there aren't 100 reasons to be outraged. There are plenty of things that are outraging me, hurting me, keeping me up at night, truly. But I want to push myself to think differently and to listen to the people who are thinking differently. So much of where I am is using the journalism to bring in the people and the conversations and the books and the articles and that I think are going to help us think in fresh ways and not just sit in our silos and repeat the things that have been repeated. And it's not that there isn't wisdom there, but I think we need some new wisdom now.
We need new wisdom now. Well, just from the beginning of this conversation, which I was really looking forward to, and it didn't disappoint, just to listen to you. And
it's so good to talk to you,
It's
David.
it's great
Really.
to just be
and
in
I say
conversation.
this, you have been not just my counsel and my teacher, but you have always said yes when I come begging to talk about some obscure piece of Judaism, and you always make it not just relevant, but make it urgent. And I think that's part of what, keeps me hopeful.
Well, this has also given me hope, and from Merrily We Roll Along, and that
it's a great musical.
It is, and now just like the sense that flop or that detour eventually becomes now this incredible victory, as it were. It kind of like brings me hope just
nice.
To think of the inevitability of
I don't know if it's a victory, but
good.
it is a landing, and I just
landing.
hope that that's part of the lesson, and even just, and I should say that like the fact that I interviewed Stephen Sondheim or Mike Wallace for my book Stars of David, it's like sometimes also these relationships come back and you're interviewing them as Jews for something that was completely un-Jewish before. It just shows you like the threads. You never know where you're going to pick them back up again.
Right, you never know. As you said, like the accidents or not,
the detour gets you to the destination you couldn't have imagined.
Exactly. So I just want to thank you again, and I look forward to having more conversations with you, Abby Pogrebin. And don't forget, everybody who's listening, In the Spotlight on Jewish Broadcast Service, and It Takes Two to Torah,
Thank
and
you.
anything else from Abigail Pogrebin.
Thank you.
Really, it's been a pleasure. I want to thank our team, our producer Efrat Bigger, our editor Maya Geyer. Our music was by Shimon Smith. Thank you to the 92nd Street Y and to Eden Sidney Foster. I'm your host, Rabbi David Ingber, and this is Detours and Destinations. See you next Tuesday for our next episode, and until then, may all of your detours be destinations.